Good morning, Boker Tov, and welcome into Mishkan, Katan. Today we have a very special treat because we have a special guest with us, and I'll bring her on stage momentarily. Her name is Dr. Dinah, and it's my incredible privilege to get to speak with her this morning about primarily her newest book that she has out. Here it is, The Greatest Exodus, and the subtitle of the book is A Divine Warrior Tradition. I've read the book. It's fabulous, and I'm very excited to share about the book and talk about it with Dr. Dye this morning. If you're not familiar with Dr. Dinah Dye, she is a luminary in the Messianic world. She was born Jewish in Canada, and as she grew up and became a young person, she embarked on a search for truth and discovered Yeshua as Israel's Messiah. And since then, she has been studying the Bible now for about 45 years. And she's written an acclaimed trilogy called the Temple Revealed Trilogy. And I hope you'll check that book out as well as checking out this one that we're going to discuss this morning. And without any further ado, let me bring Dr. Dye on board. Welcome. It's such a privilege to have you here.
Well, thank you, Gina. I really appreciate the invite. Looking forward to the conversation. Well,
excellent. The title of your book ties the Exodus, the most perhaps famous Exodus, of the book of Exodus, to the Exodus that you call the greatest Exodus, and the subtitle, A Divine Warrior Tradition. All of that together makes for a very compelling title. How did you come up with the idea for your book? Why did you think it needed to be written?
Well, as I've shared before with some others, this has sort of been percolating in my brain for quite a few years. And the more I was diving into the New Testament, I kept seeing all this sort of Exodus language, especially in the book of Matthew. As going through it chapter by chapter, I thought this matches up really with the Exodus story. And of course, anybody who's studied the book of Revelation can see a lot of Exodus referrals in that particular book. And then as I read in the book of Acts and really Paul's words, you think about Stephen telling the whole story, it seemed very clear to me that the New Testament was filled with Exodus language. I thought, well, maybe this is the story. And as I go back and look at the book of Exodus itself, you just see this compelling history over and over again. And it honestly doesn't even matter if it's a biblical story, but the story of God's people. And they are living under oppression, under some kind of empire, power, elites, or whatever. They're oppressed. In some ways, they spread and multiply even under that oppression. And then Yahweh, God, enters into the scene and delivers them from that oppression. And of course, in the Exodus story, he makes a covenant with them and then sends them out to the nations to bring the nations to God himself. So I decided to call it the greatest Exodus because I think the greatest story or the greatest aspect of deliverance is going to come with Yeshua in the New Testament when he delivers us ultimately from death being the greatest oppressor of all the, an empire an empire that's going to kill you, if you will. So this idea of death being sort of the summation of the oppressor and the deliverance from it, and just how he works through the individual human within the community and has that for all of us is once we come under his banner, under his sovereignty, is to go out again to the nations and show people that there truly is one true God who desires to be in covenant with you, wants to deliver you essentially from yourself and all your human foibles, and to bring that message to all of the world.
Right. One of the things you say on the back of your book cover is Israel's story is the story, a microcosm of the world's drama. What God began in Israel, he always intended to complete for humanity and by extension for the whole of creation. And I think a lot of times in the relationship that we begin with our great God through Yeshua, and we begin to be discipled by people, we get bits and pieces of the story. But I think it's a wonderful thing when a book is written to help us see the whole story as one big, great drama of God. And your book does that. It sort of overlays a template over the whole story and pulls out these elements. And so let's talk about some of these elements that make up this thing called the combat myth. In your book, you reveal how the Bible subverts and reworks and transforms ancient myths of the ancient Near East to reveal Yahweh as the radically different one true God. Many people, when they hear the word myth, though, they tend to interpret that as a fairy tale story. But in the cultural context of the ancient Near East, a myth had a basis in truth, right? Could you expand upon that some more for us?
Yeah, whenever I go out to teach, as soon as you use the word myth, they pretty well check out. It's very difficult for modern people because we really, by the Middle Ages, myth became something that's not true. It's fiction. It was for primitive peoples. It's how quaint, but it doesn't have anything to do with us. So there's a huge gap there. But honestly, the ancient world operated under the concept of myth. And so basically, myth it tells the human universal story using symbolic language is really the best definition of it. And of course, in their world, they operated under the structure of gods and goddesses, which we don't. I mean, we operate under a sort of scientific view. But everyone needs to explain the world around them. And so in the ancient world, the way they explained things to themselves, how things worked, why did this storm come? What was the result of this storm on our community? Why did it happen? And of course, they use the gods as an explanation. So we're not comparing Yahweh to the gods of the ancient world, but we're showing that the Bible is telling stories using mythical type language. Again, it's symbolic language, but it's referring to real things, real places, real people. And how does the Bible take the same story and as you've been mentioning, subvert it? How does it radically alter it, radically change it to show the nations around how God is different? What is he doing that's different? And the thing we have to remember is the Bible is really a story that is communicating creation language. So it takes people, places, things, families, dysfunction, all of that sort of thing, and it works through all of that because the dysfunction in families, for example, create all kinds of chaos. And we see that through, all the stories of Isaac and Jacob and Abraham, what have you, the things they do that will create chaos. But then the question we ask is, how does God elevate that story? How does God take that dysfunction and chaos and raise it up and do a work in humanity and to bring about his purposes? So the bottom line for the myth is that God transforms how the ancients saw it because he has a work he's going to do. And the whole process of the Bible is this recreation or new creation ultimately will be fulfilled in Yeshua, which is, the long story. And I appreciate that you brought up the fact that this book really drives home the fact that there is one seamless story from Genesis to Revelation. And it's fine to study different areas, but you have to see those areas as they fit into the larger narrative. And I'm afraid that a lot of people don't really even know what the larger narrative is. So again, I do see the Exodus pattern, story, narrative, however you want to speak of it, as being the big picture of the Bible.
Great. Let's talk about the elements of this ancient Near East combat myth and talk about how we see them through your book in the Bible. And the first one is the presence of chaos. And just the generation I am, when I was a child, there was this TV show called Get Smart.
Oh, and, yeah. I remember that.
Smart. Yeah. The enemy, the evil enemy, right, called what? Chaos, right? And when I was a child, I really didn't know what that word meant. But now I think back and I think, well, that makes a whole lot of sense that they chose that name for that particular evil entity. But in the ancient Near East combat myth, chaos is usually represented by a monster of some sort, whether actual monster or theoretical monster or some sort of weather happening or something like that, something that threatens the world.
Yeah. Well, we have to realize how important it was for these ancient empires to keep order in the empire, and how they did that by control, right? Really, it's not different today. And so the state was elevated to the highest level, and everything was about maintaining order and social cohesion in that environment. And so I think the word chaos really sort of summarizes everything, doesn't it? And one of the things I want to say about, because we're going to talk about these different aspects of the combat myth, is that this is a very strong theme, not just in the Bible, but in all of the ancient cultures. And the ones I have laid them out, and I tried to do it in sort of a trajectory of an orderly trajectory, if you will. But you have to understand that the Bible doesn't do this. So you could be reading one story, and you might only find a few examples of this combat myth. I've listed 8. I mean, there might be more. Some people might see less. This is the way I chose to do it. But not every single example in the combat myth is in every story in the Bible.
Right.
And specifically, when you go into the Psalms, you might only read about, there might only be 1 or 2. Say, there's chaos, and then Yahweh steps in and restores things and brings order. So just a heads up for folks, don't expect to look in a story and find these all nicely laid out in order, all 8. They just sort of appear and disappear in different parts of the Bible. But I saw it as the structure. Now, I was reading a book by a guy named Brendan Dempsey. The book was called The Combat Myth According to Mark. And a lot of scholars do see the book of Mark as being a combat myth story. And, he just presented some very intriguing things. So I kind of bounced my way off of that.
Mm-hmm.
And it was about a year ago, I started writing the book. I think December of 2024. And as I got into it, are you familiar with the Bible Project?
I've heard of it, yes.
Yeah, they're great guys, and they do a lot of similar work for me. Their scholar, Tim Mackey, sort of directs this, and they have a team of scholars. And they ended up doing an entire series on the Exodus. I think it was about 14 different sessions. And it was all excellent. It was, they covered the Exodus as well as you could cover it, really, from the Exodus story all the way through Revelation. So I was really kind of disappointed, because I thought, I think they've just covered everything I was going to cover in my book, right? And it's not like you can't, repeat or, be someone else who's writing about it. But I just felt they have a very large worldwide audience, and thought, well, I need to do something different. I don't want to just repeat everything they said. And it's going to look like they brought out these sessions, and then I just copied them. And so I just started doing some other reading. And again, I came across this book, and then I started to really see that theme of the divine warrior and the combat and the chaos and the order, because I'd already talked some about that in my previous books, the Temple Revealed series. So I had to do kind of a 180, reshuffle the deck, and I started over and began to work with this as my pattern and foundation. And it took me a little time to get going, but once I dove into it, and then I started seeing it everywhere. I know anyone who studies the Bible, if you've found an area of interest to you, a concept, a theme, whatever, and then you do some work on it, then you start seeing it everywhere. It's like when you buy a white car. Everybody has a white car when you're driving around. So whatever theme, it becomes your filter. And that's just very normal. And so I just see this as one more filter, to a lens to view the Bible through.
Right. And getting back to this idea of the presence of chaos being the first of the elements of the combat myth, some examples of that would be things like that the ancients would have been things like floods and famines, the wilderness, which
Yes.
we may talk about more later, the serpent in Gan Eden, the Garden of Eden, the Leviathan,
Yeah.
the behemoth, the behemoth, the weird beasts in Daniel's visions, the plagues of Egypt, the
Yes.
Sea of Galilee, Revelation's dragon, the beast, the false prophet, exile, and as you've mentioned, death is the last enemy, the last form of chaos. Um, anything you want to say about any of those as being chaos monsters?
Yeah, well, that's a lot of chaos right there.
Okay.
Yeah, and anyone who's studied the Bible has can recognize all of those figures in one place or another. And I know people try to nail them down, and this is who this is who that is. I'm not really sure the Bible is concerned about it in the way we often are. Like we want everything to have a certain particular meaning. But this whole idea of chaos and order is very much the structure of the ancient world. And honestly, if you look at our own world, who doesn't strive for order in your own world?
Right.
And so how the Bible is different is, and scholars will say, in Genesis chapter 1 verses 2, we have the tohu vavohu, the world was empty and void and without form. And most scholars will describe that in terms of disorder, lack of form, empty, and not so much an actual chaos monster.
Mm-hmm.
What the chaos monster, the chaos figure, or the what chaos produces usually comes through an act of violence. Like it's a violent upheaval of some kind.
Mm-hmm.
And what we see in the creation story is that God does not create through violence and control and conquering and a militaristic view. God speaks. God's spirit is poured out. God says his word has power to create. So that's an interesting even beginning in the biblical story of out of disorder and formlessness, God speaks and creates and makes the world, makes something substantive, versus the entirety of the world, how it operates to take care of chaos and to bring order is through violent militaristic action.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the main difference I want people to see. And sort of the book does talk about that, but that's what we're used to. I mean, just look at the streets today of the United States. I mean, people are acting out of violent activity in order to get their way.
Mm-hmm.
This is the complete opposite of how God operates. And so these chaos creatures, figures, actions just pop up regularly through the Bible. And the one we're first used to, of course, is what we call a Hasatan, or the adversary in the garden. And so we see this chaos creature who, creates an environment that causes Adam and Eve, to violate their oath of office in relationship to God, and then starts the whole process. And we see pictures throughout the scriptures of, it might be called the devil, like we see that in Matthew chapter 4, also in the book of Revelation. Now, in places like Isaiah in chapter 14, for example, it'll talk about a chaos figure like that as an angel, or like like it's described as Lucifer, but that's not a very good translation. A sort of bright star that is fallen, and that's referring to King Nebuchadnezzar. Also, Pharaoh is described as sort of a chaos monster in the waters, going back to the Exodus story. So the chaos figure can also be a specific person. And usually the emperor of an empire, a leader, a ruler of some kind. So we have to be careful about just blanket everything the devil, because sometimes in the Bible, the Bible is actually referring to a specific figure that is producing chaos. Now we know with the King Nebuchadnezzar, the chaos he produces for Israel is he invaded Jerusalem and Israel itself, destroyed the temple, and hauled them, the best and the brightest, back to Babylon. And this is the story of exile, and exile is very much an example of chaos because It's a place where you lose your king, you lose your temple, you lose your identity, you lose your language, and you're spread out in someone else's empire. And so everything that you had, for example, in Israel, is basically gone, and you've got to start over or try to recreate your community in exile. So exile is obviously a big component of the Bible, and it's also a great example of a community that is in chaos.
Mm-hmm. Right. You alluded already to the next two points in the combat myth, and that is that after chaos appears, the divine warrior appears. And
Yeah.
then the divine warrior, which is Yahweh and Yeshua in the Bible, confronts the chaos. And there's this cosmic battle
Yes.
between the chaos slayer and the chaos monster.
Yeah.
And that can be examples of that that I noticed in reading your book were the plagues that were sent by God on the nation of Egypt, basically on Pharaoh as the chaos monster. And then the parting at the Sea of Reeds was an example of the chaos slayer defeating the chaos monster. The events of Yeshua's ministry, beginning with his baptism, followed immediately by the encounter in the wilderness, which is a place of chaos often, with Hasatan. So we've kind of got the first three together in this drama, this great drama that we're looking at together today.
Yeah, and you mentioned the seas because that's very important. The seas is sort of the classic example of chaos in scripture and really in the ancient Near East world. The ancient Hebrews were terrified of the seas. There's a sort of dark, evil place where, the Leviathan lived, these sea monsters lived. So the seas become a very dominant theme. Even in the beginning, of course, with the Noah story, we see this waters cover the earth. Again, this idea of chaos coming. But God is going to, once again, subvert that and redeem it and bring new life out of it. This is not what you're going to see with the ancient world of, empires. They're going to exercise more control and remove people's freedom, etc. But God, we're always looking for the component of deliverance and freedom that God has, is sort of new creation life. So we have a lot of sea language, don't we, in the New Testament, because Yeshua spends a whole lot of time up on the Sea of Galilee. So a lot of the stories surrounding the Sea of Galilee have this element in it. Now, I'm not going to say everything is symbolic about what Yeshua is doing on the seas, but I think we have to put the seas back in their context, their historical context for the ancient world. And so when we see him walking on the waters, and I'm not going to argue whether he did or didn't, the point here is that he is basically, the seas became to represent the nations because the nations produced chaos. And so there's this idea of his sovereignty over the whole earth, over all of the nations. And then, there's a lot of language about the demoniacs, et cetera, the one in particular, the Gadarenes, et cetera. So they have a backstory. So we have an event, it's a real place, a real person, a real thing, but we have the backstory of what is the writer of the Bible trying to communicate to us. And so again, seas here are important because they're basically all through the Bible, especially when you read through in Psalms, et cetera, you'll see language of God having sovereignty over the seas.
Right. Here at Mishkan Katan, we're doing a study of the Psalms, and we'll continue with that next week. And you're right. There's a lot of language about the raging seas and how God exerts his mastery over them, and we're throughout
Yeah.
the Psalms.
Classic divine warrior language.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. So then the next thing in the myth is that.
Well, let me just interject here with one thing, because this combat myth is universal. Every ancient culture had combat myth events. And even in the Bible, we have like Baal Tzephon was the storm god. Lots of times the divine warrior is seen as a storm god who will defeat. And so I want people, it's not just the Bible that has this combat myth story. That is the culture and context. But that every ancient culture has it. And you just see, if you read any kind of myths and legends of the ancient Romans and Greeks and, Assyrians, Babylonians, whatever, there's just constant battles because they're trying, one is trying to take over the other with the goal of bringing sort of quote unquote peace to the world. But it's just in this constant state of battle. And I was just in Greece about a month ago. Spent some time in Athens, and I mean, this was just so interesting to me. Went to the Acropolis Museum, which is a museum below Acropolis, the main high city in Athens, and up on the Acropolis you have several temples: the Parthenon, the Erechtheion, and the Temple of Athena. All dedicated to Athena. She is the goddess over Athens. Obviously, that's why it's called Athens, the goddess Athena. But in the museum, there was a whole gallery of these. They have these things called metopes. They're sort of triangular. They fit up into these temples. They're triangular reliefs, and they had several of them, all in a line. And I was just struck walking down, looking at each one, that these were all combat myth battles. That you see Athena fighting various gods for control, to maintain control over that world. And one of the areas is she was constantly fighting giants, which I found very interesting. There were several of these metopes, and they're called pediments, in which she is fighting and doing battle with giants. So I couldn't help but see that element, of course, in the Bible, where we have several mentions, like in Genesis chapter 6, and people go on about the Nephilim, etc. But it just struck me, if we understand that this world is a world of constant combat, like it's exhausting. And who doesn't want and strive for peace where there's just order and you can rest? So the divine warrior's job is to bring about that rest.
Yes, exactly. And in fact, when you were talking about the 8 elements, I actually added a ninth at the end, and that ninth was rest.
Yes.
That's the ultimate goal and the ultimate outcome. I remember when I was a child, there was a cartoon that would play on Sunday mornings, and I would watch it on Sunday mornings when I was getting ready to go to services with my family, and it was about Hercules.
Right.
And Hercules was almost always, it was a story of combat myth.
Yep.
He was almost always fighting a giant.
Yep.
And when you said that, it made me remember, sometimes it was a cyclops, and sometimes it was, some other chaos monster, but he was always fighting a monster, a chaos monster.
So in our own lives, it's essentially the same. We're always fighting ourselves. There's always, you don't just sort of come to rest in yourself and everything's good and I'm just going to coast here. You find yourself with constant battles against, we have to deal with greed or social disorder or, just gossip, whatever. Paul has a nice list of all the things that we do. So our human nature, that concept, the divine warrior, and us battling our human nature. The great thing here, the greatest exodus here, is that Yeshua delivers us through repentance from ourselves and from this battle to give us that rest.
Right, exactly. And we're so thankful for that.
And sister, I should mention too, the first book I ever remember getting from my parents was called The Wonderful World of Myths and Legends. I think I was about 8 years old. And that was the most fascinating book to me. And, honestly don't know if just that root took hold, because I've always kind of been interested in this in the ancient Near East world. And even when I was in college, sort of studied ancient Babylon, Assyria, et cetera, I've just always had a fascination with that. So it's kind of exciting to take all of that and finally put it into words and create for people this sort of bigger story.
That's so incredible. That gift made such a difference.
Yeah.
You think back on your life and things that seemed not to be significant at the time. The Lord uses them, and he weaves them into what he wants to do with your life. It's just such a beautiful and miraculous thing. Well, as you mentioned, in our story of the combat myth, the divine warrior is ultimately victorious, and after his victory, order is restored.
Yes.
And then there is the proclamation of good news, announced often by a herald. And you spent some time in your book talking about heralds and their function within the combat myth. You want to tell the audience a little more about that?
Well, sure. And to back up just a little bit, so the divine warrior defeats chaos, and of course, as you mentioned, order comes. And so one of the things through that is there's going to be a whole process for the divine warrior to become king.
Mhm.
His enthronement will be established through his defeat of the other king or god or whatever it is. So again, as I mentioned, there's this constant uh, fight between these two. One wins, and then one is crowned king. So in order to be crowned king, you need a temple. That's where he's going to locate himself. And so then there's a whole process just to get to the temple. So after the temple is going to be built for him, but now before that even happens, we have something called the herald, or going to be the announcer of the good news. Now I know for Christians, that context for that, of course, is that Jesus died to save you and deliver you, and if you repent. And but the good news is way bigger than that. The good news really is that the king has defeated the enemy. That's
Right.
the real good news. So in the ancient world, the herald would always go out ahead of everyone else to the city or wherever and announce to the people the king has won the battle. This is great news. And the king in that will restore order for the empire, whatever.
Mhm.
So this herald goes out and announces this. And you see this in the Roman Empire, is quite common. And so the good news is very much larger than what we're used to thinking. It's not that Jesus saves you, end of story. It's that the king is going to take his seat on the throne and rule and reign and bring peace and order to the empire. So we have a lot of herald type language. In the story, in the Red Sea story, the defeat when the seas part, and of course children of Israel go through on dry ground. And then we have after that Miriam, song of Miriam. She sings the song of the sea. So I suggest in the Bible we have a lot of examples of the herald as women, that
Mhm.
women are the ones that go forth first to announce whatever the good news. And I would really recommend folks go back and read the Exodus story, and especially around chapters 14 and 15, which encapsulates all this. And so the ultimate culmination, of course, is when Yeshua is raised from the dead. We see that women are the ones that go to the grave, see that the grave is empty, and now are out announcing kind of the good news. So this good news is bigger than just Jesus saves and you're not going to hell. The
Mhm.
good news is that the rightful king is on the throne and he is bringing rest and order. And so now you can live under his sovereignty in an orderly relationship and expect to live in quote peace.
Right, right. And probably, I think when people are asked to think of a herald in the New Testament, probably the first person that comes to their mind is John the Baptist.
Correct. Yeah. And I should have elaborated on that because for sure, he is preparing the way for Yeshua,
Mhm.
announcing what needs to be announced in preparation for Yeshua's ministry. And a lot of what's going on with John the Baptist, John the Immerser, comes to us from Isaiah, starting in
Mhm.
Isaiah 40, going on to about Isaiah 55. We see this one who will come and announce the good news and bring comfort and peace and healing. And so John perfectly fulfills that role as well. So again, go back and reread the early chapters of Matthew, and you can see how John is functioning as a herald.
Right, right. Behold the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world, he said.
Amen. That's good news.
Yeah, yeah, that's good news. So then, after the herald, there's, as you mentioned, there's this procession. There's like this big parade,
Yeah.
and the parade leads ultimately to the temple or the palace.
Yep.
then the analogies in scripture to that, one that I hadn't really thought about was that Israel's wilderness journey was a procession of
Yes.
and along the way, they had these purifying experiences. They experienced this internal spiritual growth, this internal liberation, because when they came out of Egypt, they were still in their minds and in their spirits, they were still a slave people. They still viewed themselves and saw themselves and actually behaved as slaves a lot of the time. So in the wilderness during this procession, they were purified, they were refined.
Yeah, no, and we don't tend to see, again, we miss sort of the big story because we think, okay, well, the children of Israel crossed through the sea and then they wandered in the wilderness and eventually they're going back to the land. But it's this whole story that keeps pushing. And so through the story of the wilderness and their procession, of course, they immediately go to Mount Sinai, where God is enthroned, and they have established a covenant relationship with God. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. They're given the commandments, or basically the structure on how to have a cohesive society. But we don't think of it in a larger term as sort of this procession to worship God. And so on the mountain in Sinai, this is a whole worship environment. I mean, that was the whole point of leaving Egypt, was to be able to go and worship their God. And so it takes a long time, and they got to go through the process through the wilderness, and they mess up often, kind of go back to square one, if you will, run into enemies, don't do a very good job of it, fetch, complain, runs the whole gamut. So, we got this concept of a 40-year period in which they are supposed to be worshiping their God. And then after Sinai, of course, they even have the tabernacle where the presence of God is, to where they're worshiping their God, and still, problems.
Right.
And then they'll cross over the Jordan in the same way they crossed the Reed Sea, the Sea of Reeds, it should be called, and eventually get to Jerusalem and a temple will be built. Now, this is a very long, long period of time.
Right.
But the goal is always worship. And so we see in the New Testament, Yeshua, of course, what we call Palm Sunday, which I feel is inaccurate. I don't really know for sure. Some scholars have suggested that event is actually taking place at Sukkot, or Feast of Tabernacles, but honestly, there's no way to prove that. If you're reading the chronology, you do tend to sandwich it and place it right before Passover, but there's a case to be made that maybe it's not right at that point. But regardless, this is very much a procession where they're waving their palm fronds, their palm branches, and laying them on the ground and putting down their clothes. And he's, with the donkey going into Jerusalem. This is very much a procession to where he's supposed to he's the rightful heir of the throne, the rightful king, and he should take his seat on the throne in Jerusalem in the temple. But that temple's got to be cleansed. He can't at this time. We got big problems in Jerusalem in the temple, right? So, and not just these two events, but all through the Psalms, you can see very much procession type language. And all of the purpose of the procession is for the people to come into the presence of God and worship him.
Right, right. I'm glad you mentioned that, because I was going to bring that up as another procession, the triumphant entry into Jerusalem.
Yeah, it's fascinating when you look at it from that context, which I don't think very many people have.
No, absolutely not. But you're right. There's a lot of Sukkot imagery in that event.
Yes.
Which
I mean, there's no question people tie them together. The big question is it actually a Sukkot, or are we playing out Sukkot at Passover? And we don't really know.
We don't. No, we don't. Then, after the procession, I found this very interesting. The chaos slayer, the king, as he is about to be crowned at his coronation, as he's about to be enthroned, he goes through this debasement.
Yeah. Isn't that interesting?
Yes, this lowering, this condescension, like the way up is down, sort of
Yeah.
event. Talk to us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I was just fascinated to see in the ancient world culturally when a king was going to go through the ceremony, the ritual for his enthronement. The first thing they would do was go through this whole debasing process, and they would remove his clothes and they would put on different clothes. And uh, I had never realized that was the case. So I mean, who doesn't think of Yeshua when you're reading that going, that's exactly what he went through, right? I mean, it goes
To an
down
extreme
into
level.
Sheol and,
Mhm,
and they strip him of his clothes and they put on, a fake robe and put the crown of thorns in his head, but all of it is a debasing and mocking
mhm,
experience. And so that was very much a part of the rituals for ancient kings. And
mhm,
then it's like they changed form, and they went from this ritual debasement to sort of divine.
mhm.
And this was an important process for them to be raised up. And then, of course, they would make their way to the temple for the entirety of the enthronement ceremony. But that was an important component of the ceremony itself.
Yeah, yeah. It's amazing that we see that in the story of Yeshua.
Yeah.
That it fits with that. And I remember in the book, you made the point that it was a fake coronation that the Roman soldiers did uh, with Yeshua, but it had elements of coronation. There was the
Yeah.
crown, there
Yeah.
was the robe, the royal robe, and sort of thing. And you know, I'm an educator by trade before I retired, and one of the key principles they would always teach us about education was you have to start where the student's frame of knowledge is. You have to start there. You can't start above that or beyond that. You have to start there. And the great thing about this study is that it illustrates that God used the frame of reference of the people of that day
Yeah.
to deliver his message. He tied it in. It's like Paul, when Paul would teach, Paul did the same thing. When he went to, I think it was Athens, and he was speaking in the town square, and there were all these statues to all these gods, and there was this one to the unknown God. And he keyed into that. He linked onto that, and he said, "Let me tell you who this unknown God is." you know
That's
and
funny you should bring up, because I was just standing in that spot about a month ago. After we came down from the Acropolis, we went to the area. There's this series of rocks where Paul probably stood and conveyed that message. So I had my husband take a few shots of me with the background of the Acropolis, standing in a spot that maybe Paul spoke about the unknown God. And the idea of just being surrounded by gods, statues of gods, was just so obvious to me, because you have, obviously they're in museums and stuff, but it's just everywhere. It just dominates the environment. And then out of this one true God that Paul speaks of. That was kind of interesting.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I'm a little envious of that trip. It sounds wonderful. Well, so here we have our debased king, and
Hmm.
now we're going to have the enthronement. And
Yes.
some of the things that you mentioned in your book at this point that I thought were so interesting was all this cosmic imagery. The
Yes.
earthquakes and the fire and the loud shofar blasts and the lightning. We had those at Sinai. We had the earthquakes and the thunder at the crucifixion. And then you mentioned cosmic mountains, places where these coronations take place, these sacred spaces, like the sages say that Eden was on top of a mountain,
Mhm.
and that, of course, Sinai, a mountain, the tabernacle was a type of sacred mountain, the temple, and then the body of Yeshua is a Mishkan Katan. is a little tabernacle. Each one of us is a little tabernacle as part of the larger ecclesia of Yeshua. And I just felt that all of those elements were so fascinating. The coronation music, the ceremonies, the public declarations, all of that was so fascinating, and how the cross became a coronation, a place of coronation,
Yeah.
a meeting place of heaven and earth. And he was actually suspended between heaven and earth. It's just fascinating.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, the cosmic mountain is another dominant theme in the Bible, along with the seas. And as you study sort of the ancient world, how they viewed it is when dry ground appeared, they called it the primeval hillock. That's what they referred to it in Egypt. But it would be this dry ground that would turn into a mountain, because the mountain was sort of the first fixed place of stability and permanence out of the seas.
Yes.
So mountains became the structure of stability and location. For the top would be temples, and where the king would rule and reign from. And so it's important to recognize all through the scriptures how many events take place at mountains. Of course, as you mentioned, Eden, we usually see the garden as sort of on a flat horizontal plane, but actually the imagery is on a vertical plane, is how we're supposed to see it, like a mountain, and that the waters came from the top and went off into 4 different directions. So the top of the mountain. And a Noah's Ark lands on Mount Ararat. And the imagery of Noah's Ark is actually as a temple on a mountain. And that's a whole nother book and story and an episode. And then, of course, Sinai becomes, the mountain. All these significant events that deal with enthronement and covenant with God are always happening on top of a mountain. So I wrote an entire chapter really on the cosmic mountain.
Right.
And we see that obviously into the New Testament as well. I compared in the book of Matthew, all of the major events that take place with Yeshua take place on mountains. And actually there are 7 mountains where events happen. I'm like, this can't be an accident. It's very fascinating. And again, depending on which scholar you talk to, Moses' ascent, remember he was up and down the mountain after the tablets were, broken, and back up, etc. But it appears from most scholars that there were 7 ascents of Moses. So I tried to tie those things together. But all of these very important events of Yeshua's life in the book of Matthew. So, for example, Luke doesn't have mountains. Stuff happens in the plains. But the writer of Matthew, for his purposes, took these mountain experiences to show us what was happening. And so the final mountain, of course, is the mountain of the Great Commission to send the disciples out to the 4 corners of the earth. So cosmic mountains, very, very significant, important for you to recognize in Scripture and to evaluate in a deeper way.
Mm-hmm. And, I was just sitting here thinking while you were talking, you've got the 4 gospel accounts, and someone might wonder, well, why do you need to hear the story 4 times? Right. But each author emphasized different things to different audiences.
Correct.
Once you realize that, then it's so much more meaningful. Well, then once we have the coronation on top of the mountain, there's then a royal banquet. This is number 8. This is the 8th of the 8 elements of the combat myth and the divine warrior tradition. And so the covenant meal, the royal banquet in Scripture, there was one at Sinai. There was one at Passover. There was one that we call the Lord's Supper. And there were others in addition to that I hadn't really thought about as covenant meals, but there was the very brief meal with the followers of Yeshua who were walking on the road to Emmaus.
Right.
There was that, and then there was the eating of the fish that Yeshua took the fish by the side of the Kinneret, the Sea of Galilee, and so then in the future, as revealed in the book of Revelation, we will have what's called the marriage supper of the Lamb. And all of these have key elements in common.
Yeah. I mean, that's another area. I mean, you could just expand this, study this out, but covenants were always sealed with a meal, and that would be bread and wine. So, I mean, go back to Abraham with Melchizedek. I mean, just about every single story has an element in there of a meal being eaten with bread and wine. The one that always fascinates me too is when Joseph is thrown into the pit. Remember that? And his brothers are sitting there having a meal. I'm like, this is too weird. But this covenant meal is really, really important. And it seals the entirety of the enthronement ceremony and the covenant relationship with God himself, certainly in the Bible. But in the ancient world, they had covenant meals as well with bread and wine. Of course, Passover as a covenant meal. The Passover lamb is not actually a sin offering the way we view it, but is actually a thanksgiving offering, a fellowship offering that unites two parties together in a covenant relationship. So it's not really about your sin per se, but more about restoring the covenant relationship, which we do, of course, through repentance, and currently how this operates. And so you see, like in Exodus 16, where they collect the manna and there's the whole meal thing in there. You've got meal stories with Ruth. You've got meals being referred to in Psalms. Once again, Psalms has all of these elements in it, and on and on. And of course, the conclusion of the book of Revelation, as you mentioned, the marriage supper of the Lamb, is a covenant meal to cement the covenant relationship and declare that God is sovereign and ruler over heaven and earth through his son, Yeshua the Messiah. So very important element in the Bible as well.
Right. And I remember when I studied the Jewish marriage process.
Sure, yeah.
And of course, this is not the same in our Western world, but when the betrothal, the ketubah, the marriage contract was signed, afterward there was bread and wine.
Yes,
all
absolutely.
things, and it's just a thread that runs throughout. Well, then, after this, the king is on the throne, and there is rest, there is order, there are often new laws that are written, there are new rituals and orders restored through the enactment of those. And that's what we have to look forward to when the king returns and sets up his kingdom here on earth. In the Olam Haba, the world to come, we will have rest and order and peace and beauty and the absence of tears and death. And we will see him panim el panim, face to face.
Sounds good right about now, I'll tell you.
Yeah, it sounds really good right about now. Well, when I was communicating with you about this interview, I sent you, some notes and some questions and this and that. And you said, you do realize, Gina, that you have about 5 hours worth of material here that you want to talk about. And you know what? I'm just grateful that we have gotten through.
Yeah. No, we did a great job.
Talking at least about the combat myth, which is kind of the steel backbone of your book. But there's so many other wonderful things that we could talk about. You mentioned in your book, and talking about this, you mentioned so many incredibly wonderful patterns. And some of them we have alluded to today. We mentioned the one where, the mountains of Moses and the mountains of Yeshua's ministry. We could spend 30 minutes probably just talking about that. And then, we talked about the role of the women, and how you go on to say in your book that there were 7 pillars of wisdom's house, and 7 key women who nurtured and cared for Moses, and the 7 women in Yeshua's Matthew genealogy, and 7 daughters of Jethro, and there's just so many beautiful patterns that we could talk about that are revealed in this book. So I really want to encourage our listeners who are either listening live today or will see this interview later to go pick up a copy of Dr. Dinah's book here. It's really it is a fulfilling read. When you read it, you feel like you've had a healthy meal, because it's robust, and it's full of beautiful material, and Dinah writes beautifully. She just writes in such a beautiful, touching style that's just so engaging. So
I do have a great editor as well. Well, and so, honestly, for example, for the patterns, we could just take the pattern of 7 here with the women, and I could write a whole book on that.
Right.
So my goal was to introduce these ideas to folks, and for them to take this on and to go deeper and start examining it for themselves, because there's no way I could cover it all. I wanted to give a nice overview to give you some options for deeper study. And I should mention too, the book is on Amazon. It's easy to find, and it's also in Spanish. El Gran Exodo, and thank you to Lisa Velasquez, who translated it for me. She did a bang-up job on that, so you can get it in English and Spanish. Again, right there on Amazon. It's very easy, and I really hope people will read it. And please reach out to me if you have any questions. It's just dinah.die@protonmail.com. You can send me a note if there's something that you find compelling or confusing, or you want to understand it better. But I really appreciate you having me on, and we did cover quite a bit of ground. I'm impressed, Gina. There's a lot of material. So.
Well, it was a pure pleasure. It really was, and I just feel honored that Lamb asked me to sit down with you and talk about your wonderful book. And thank you again for your time. Time is a precious gift, and maybe we can talk together again in the future.
Yes,
I would love that.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thanks so much for having me.
Yes, of course. Well, we're going to say shalom, shalom, everybody, for this episode of Mishkan Katan. And we look forward to seeing you back here next week, where we'll resume our study of the Psalms. If you missed today's show or want to watch it again, or want to tell someone where they can watch this episode, go to lambnetwork.tv, where you will find the show and all the other live Lamb Show archives in the on-demand section of the website. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to tell someone about the Messianic Lamb Network. We are richly blessed to bring you what we believe is the fullest, most diverse, yet up-to-date progressive teachings, discussions, and prayer programming you can find anywhere on this planet. Be sure to take the tour of the lambnetwork.tv website. I'm Gina Hood, thanking you for joining us on the Messianic Lamb Video Network.